1820. That number sits in the official record like a gravestone. That is the year they tell us Antarctica was first sighted. In that episode, I examined what mainstream history calls the year without a summer, 1816, the year following the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. According to the official record, that single volcano ejected enough ash into the upper atmosphere to drive down global temperatures, obliterate harvests across the northern hemisphere, slaughter livestock, ignite famine from New England to northern Europe, and transform summer into winter. Tambora, a single mountain. The explanation is immaculate. The timeline is seamless. But then I began pulling on threads that had no business belonging to that story. Because here is what the official account cannot explain: the uniformity. The staggering, continent-spanning, simultaneous collapse of everything at once. Crop failures were not regional. They were planetary. Reports of unnatural cold, of snow falling in June, of skies burning orange and purple at sunset. They were not clustered near Indonesia. They were everywhere, simultaneously, and not merely environmentally, socially, politically. The years that followed 1816 saw a cascade of institutional fractures, mass population displacements, and what one researcher I encountered described as civilizational amnesia. Entire communities appearing to sever all continuity with what had come before. In that video, I proposed something I knew would unsettle many of you. Good. It should have. I proposed that the year without a summer was not simply a volcanic event, or more precisely, that it may not have been only a volcanic event, that the atmospheric catastrophe of 1816 bore the signature of something far larger, something more deliberate, something closer to what we would recognize today as a nuclear winter. A sudden, total blackout of the sky, not from a mountain, but from a civilization-ending event. A reset. The kind of event that leaves behind not just climate data, but erasure. Deliberate, sweeping, systemic erasure. The kind of event now quietly associated with a hypothesis that before the 19th century, there existed a global civilization, sophisticated, architecturally masterful, connected across continents, that we have come to call, provisionally, Tartaria. Not an empire in the traditional sense, not a nation with lines on a modern map. Something harder to define, a presence, a civilization whose fingerprints are pressed into stone on every continent, visible everywhere once you learn to read them. In the architecture, in the canal systems, in the city grids that appear in the historical record fully formed, without construction phases, without scaffolding periods, without any of the messy, incremental archaeology that should accompany the rise of human settlement. And then, apparently, it was simply gone. We covered all of that. But there was one detail I kept returning to. One date I kept setting aside because it felt almost too perfectly placed, too surgically convenient to be accidental. The date Antarctica was discovered. 4 years after the year without a summer. Hold that gap in your mind. 4 years. Not a generation. Not a century. 4 years after what may have been the most catastrophic atmospheric event in all of recorded human history. An event that, if my previous analysis holds, may have been the terminal convulsion of a global civilization. An event in which the entire world froze simultaneously. And then, the most remote, most inaccessible, most sealed, most frozen landmass on the planet is suddenly officially discovered. Not by one expedition, by 3. Simultaneously, a British crew, an American crew, a Russian crew, all operating independently, we are told, all converging on the same region, all within months of each other, all in 1820. I am not going to tell you that is impossible. Discoveries compete. Expeditions overlap. Ambition drives exploration. I understand the mechanics, but I want to ask a different kind of question. Not whether it happened, but why then? Why, after millennia of human civilization, after the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, After every sophisticated maritime culture that ever drove a hull into open water, why does the largest landmass south of the equator remain entirely undiscovered, undocumented, and unnamed until 4 years after the world's sky went dark? Why then? Because this is where the conventional account begins to fracture. The further I descended into the cartographic record, into archives that never appear in the introductory history courses, the more the 1820 discovery date began to look less like a beginning and more like a cover story. There are maps, actual surviving, historically documented, academically verified maps that show Antarctica long before 1820. The Peary Race map, dated 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral who explicitly stated he was compiling it from older source maps, shows a southern landmass with a detailed, precise coastline. Not a vague blur, not a speculative fringe, a charted coastline that, when 20th century researchers overlaid it against modern satellite imaging of subglacial terrain, the actual rock beneath 2 miles of ice, aligned with a precision no one has adequately explained. The Orontius Phineas map from 1531 goes further still. It depicts Antarctica without ice, with river systems, with mountain ranges, with internal geographic features that humanity only confirmed using mid-20th century sonar technology. Let me say that again, slowly, because it is easy to read past it. A map drawn in 1531 shows geographic features of Antarctica that we did not technologically confirm until the 1950s. The official explanation collapses almost immediately under the weight of that single sentence. The academic response has historically been coincidence, lucky extrapolation. The suggestion that ancient cartographers were philosophically guessing at a southern landmass for reasons of symmetry, that the north must be mirrored by the south. And perhaps that is true. Perhaps it is coincidence. But how do you guess a river? How do you guess subglacial mountain ridges? How do you guess a coastline with sufficient accuracy that it survives comparison to satellite data 5 centuries into the future? You do not guess that. You do not theorize that. You map it. From observation, from presence, from knowledge that was either firsthand or inherited from someone who stood there and saw it. And that raises the question this record has never satisfyingly answered. Who was there? If you're finding this worth your time, and I hope you are, consider subscribing or becoming a YouTube member. This series goes places most channels refuse to enter. Having you here means everything. Now, back to Antarctica. We are only just beginning. I want to return to 1816 for a moment, because I think we have been examining it from entirely the wrong angle. In the previous video, I built the case that the atmospheric catastrophe of 1816, whatever its true origin, may have functioned as the terminal moment of an old-world civilization. The event that ended something. The nuclear winter that followed what may have been a civilization-scale obliteration, leaving behind depopulated cities, orphaned infrastructure, and a historical record so skeletal it barely deserves the name. But what if that framing is only partially true? What if 1816 was not only an ending? What if it was also, for someone, a beginning? Here is the theory I have been carrying, and I want to be clear. I am presenting this as a question, not a conclusion. What if the atmospheric event of 1816, whatever mechanism generated it, was capable not only of shattering the Northern Hemisphere's climate, but of accelerating glaciation at the poles? What if the same force that converted summer to winter across Europe and North America also, in some compounding, cascading way, drove ice formation southward? What if Antarctica, the ice-free continent visible on 16th century maps, was in the process of freezing or had only recently frozen, and 1816 was either the final phase of that sealing or a rehearsal of it? I know the gravity of that. I am not making it as a claim. I am making it as a shape, a pattern of timing and geography and suppression that I cannot stop tracing, because consider what comes next. 1816. The sky goes dark. A global atmospheric event of staggering, unprecedented scope ruptures civilization itself. 1820. Antarctica is discovered. Officially entered into the record, named, catalogued, claimed. Not before, not during, after. 4 years after. The pattern emerges. And once you see it, you cannot make your eyes unfocus. Stay with the timeline. Because it does not end at 1820. The same thread, the maps, the knowledge, the carefully preserved secret of what Antarctica truly is, keeps resurfacing. Decades later, in the hands of people who commanded every resource on Earth and used those resources to go and look. 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States Navy launches Operation High Jump, a full military expedition to Antarctica. Not a research team, not a modest exploratory vessel, 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 military personnel, led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated officers in American history. The stated objective was scientific, mapping, research, establishing a base, and maybe that is all it was. But here is the part that makes the timing impossible to dismiss. Because the Americans were not the first military power to take Antarctica with deadly seriousness. Not even close. In 1938, 7 years before Operation High Jump, Nazi Germany launched its own Antarctic expedition, the Schwabenland Expedition. They mapped nearly 600 square kilometers of territory, dropped thousands of marker stakes to assert territorial claim, and reportedly returned with something that shifted priorities at the highest levels of the Reich. What, exactly? We are not told. The records are incomplete in the precise, deliberate way that records tend to become incomplete when the answer genuinely matters. What we do know: German submarines were documented operating in Antarctic waters as late as 1945, and certain senior figures in the Nazi scientific apparatus carried a known documented obsession with ancient knowledge, with lost civilizations, with pre-modern cartographic traditions inherited from a world that no longer existed. The same maps, the same thread, which brings us back to the custodian problem. The Piri Reis map, the Orontius Phineas map. The admiral himself stated he compiled those charts from older source maps, sources that are never named, never located, never accounted for. Someone held that knowledge. Some chain of hands preserved it across centuries, across the rupture of 1816, intact enough that multiple parties, an Ottoman admiral, a Nazi expedition, an American naval fleet, apparently followed it to the same place. Who were they? And what did all three find when they arrived? The evidence does not answer that, but it does not dismiss it either. Now I want to speak about what we are not permitted to do, because this is the part of the Antarctica conversation most people glide past, and I believe it is the most devastating part. You cannot freely go to Antarctica, I want to be precise. The casual response is, of course you can. Expeditions go there constantly. And yes, they do. Scientific expeditions, government-sanctioned research missions, tourism even in limited and heavily supervised forms. I am not claiming the continent is ringed by an invisible wall. What I am saying is this: the Antarctic Treaty system, signed in 1959 and now ratified by over 50 nations, formally designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve. It explicitly prohibits military activity, mineral extraction, and nuclear testing on the continent. And in practice, it renders independent, unsupervised exploration of the Antarctic interior functionally impossible, not precisely illegal, just impossible. You need logistical support that only governments and massive institutions can provide. You need permissions that are consistently difficult to obtain outside pre-approved research parameters. You need infrastructure that does not exist for the independent traveler. The result: Antarctica is the one place on this earth that an ordinary person in the 21st century cannot simply go and look. And I want to ask, why does that feel normal? Every other landmass on the planet, every mountain range, Every jungle, every scorched desert can be reached by a determined individual with sufficient resources. People summit Everest recreationally. People cross the Sahara alone. People sail to the most desolate islands on Earth with nothing but a small vessel and a compass. But Antarctica has a treaty. 50 nations signed it in the same decade that sonar technology first confirmed what was concealed beneath the ice, and we do not find that remarkable. We nod along. We accept that the treaty is about science, about peace, about environmental stewardship, the way we absorb everything, passively, without resistance. But the coordination problem, the longer you sit with it, becomes impossible to ignore. 50 nations, all agreeing, all signing, all sustaining that agreement without fracture for decades, about a frozen continent that officially contains nothing of consequence but ice and penguins. What is it about ice and penguins that demands an international treaty? Let me tell you about the architecture problem, because this is where the Tartaria connection stops being theoretical. Throughout this series, we have documented, imperfectly, provisionally, but documented, the haunting presence of old-world construction techniques in places that have no reasonable explanation for them. Buildings that materialize in the historical record fully complete, without construction phases. Civic infrastructure in cities supposedly founded in the early 19th century that would have demanded decades of labor and resources those young settlements simply never possessed. Cathedrals in frontier towns, elaborate sewer systems in cities that were, by official record, wilderness 5 years before those systems existed. The mud flood evidence, the buried ground floors, the windows that open below what is now street level, because the street level has climbed, or because something came down and buried what was already standing. This pattern does not belong to one region. It repeats across North America, across Europe, across Russia, across South America. It is not isolated. It is not regional. It is global. And every time we document it, the official explanation arrives dressed in dismissal, or that particular casual hand-waving that dissolves the instant you press it against actual evidence. The transition periods are absent. The documentation is threadbare. The workforce that supposedly erected these structures is unaccounted for. The supply chains do not exist. The timelines do not hold. Something was already there. Something was built by someone who came before. And now, Antarctica. We know from the cartographic evidence, from the ice-free maps, from the subglacial topography, that Antarctica was, at some point in historical time, a habitable landmass. Not geologically ancient, historically recent. Recent enough that human beings mapped it from direct observation. Recent enough that those maps survived into the 16th century, copied forward from sources older still. What was on that continent? What rests under 2 miles of ice right now? I am not claiming there are pyramids beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Those structures in the Ellsworth Mountains have generated genuine academic debate about their geometry. I am not claiming a lost city lies sealed beneath the Ross ice shelf. I am asking something simpler and more important. Why don't we know? Why in 2025, with ground-penetrating radar capable of imaging features thousands of meters below the surface, with orbital systems that can resolve a license plate from space, with the full technological weight of the most advanced civilization in recorded history trained on every last corner of this Earth, why is the subglacial topography of Antarctica still largely unmapped at high resolution? Why do the gaps in the data cluster precisely in the interior? Why does the silence persist? The silence, when you begin truly listening, is everywhere in this story. No serious mainstream academic discussion of the Peary race map appears in introductory curricula. It is a footnote, if it surfaces at all. No institutional inquiry into the coordination problem of 1820. 3 independent expeditions converging simultaneously on an undiscovered continent. No convergence. Coincidence. Moving on. No institutional curiosity about the gulf between the ice-free maps of the 16th century and the frozen wasteland officially discovered in the 19th. No explanation for how, if the ice accumulated over geological time as we are told, human cartographers produced charts showing the underlying terrain in historical time. The silence is not accidental. Silence this vast, spanning this many disciplines sustained for this long, is not the absence of evidence. It is a shape, and that shape is pointing at something. I will not tell you what. I think you already feel it. I want to close with something that has been pressing against me since I first began pulling this thread. If we accept, provisionally, carefully, with every appropriate measure of skepticism, that before the 19th century there existed a global civilization of staggering sophistication, if we accept that this civilization left behind infrastructure, maps, architectural mastery, and preserved knowledge that our official history cannot begin to account for, if we accept that the events of 1816 represented, in some terrible form, the terminal convulsion of that civilization, a collapse so total, so violent, that it branded the atmosphere with scars visible across the northern hemisphere. And if we accept that Antarctica, the last unmapped ice-free landmass on those older charts, was then sealed, frozen, treaty-locked, and quietly withdrawn from public reach in the years immediately following, then we must ask the hardest question of all. What were they protecting? Not from us, necessarily. Perhaps from time. Perhaps from chaos, perhaps simply from the kind of uncoordinated, ungoverned discovery that might have unraveled everything. Had anyone with a ship and a burning curiosity been allowed to sail south and start uncovering what lay beneath? What knowledge was stored there? What records? What architecture? What evidence of a civilization that we have been? Through some devastating combination of catastrophe, deliberate erasure, and institutional incuriosity, prevented from ever knowing. I don't have the answer. I want to be honest with you about that. I have lived inside these questions for months. They have not resolved. They have only deepened. The further I move into the record, the more I find not answers, but structure. The unmistakable silhouette of something deliberately obscured, something whose outline I can trace without ever being permitted to see its face. Once you see that structure, you cannot make your eyes go soft again. An atmospheric catastrophe in 1816, unprecedented in scope and duration. An official continent discovered 4 years later by 3 nations simultaneously, then sealed by 50 nations a century after that. Ancient maps that show what lies beneath the ice. A historical record that goes silent at precisely the moments where continuity should exist. Architecture without builders, cities without origins, a civilization without a gravestone, and a continent, renamed, restricted, ice-encased, quietly held just beyond reach, that may contain, under 2 miles of frozen ancient silence, the answer to all of it. Maybe, or maybe not. But I cannot stop returning to that number, and I don't think you will either. If this series means something to you, leave your thoughts, your theories, in the comments below. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't certain I was ready to go. I think I am now. I'll see you there.